Hi everybody. I hope you have enjoyed your very long summer that you've had this year and that you're ready to get started with work this year. Welcome to APUSH History, and the purpose of this audio PowerPoint is to really go over the information from Chapter 1. Much of it you already have in your notes, but really just to reiterate that you're getting the main points, as we will not be able to go over this information in class, yet it is 5% of the AP exam and 5% of your class. One, to explain how and why the various native populations in the period before European contact interacted with the natural environment in North America. Also to explain the causes of exploration and conquest of the New World by Spain, and the causes of the Columbian Exchange and its effect on Europe and the Americas during the period after 1492. Finally, our last objective would be to really discuss the growth of the Spanish Empire in North America, although the Spanish were really more predominant in Central and South America, but the growth in North America, Texas, California, and so forth, and how that can shape the development of social and economic structures over time. So I want to start with really kind of an overview of this period. 1492 was a big, important year in the history of the world. Prior to 1492, it was as if there were two worlds that existed, neither aware of each other. In the Western Hemisphere, the American, Indians that, had developed a wide variety of civilizations and cultural groups, ranging from, the highly developed Aztec Empire and Inca Empire in Mesoamerica and South America, respectively, to the relatively less developed nomadic and semi-nomadic tribes of North America. And this contact between the Europeans and Native Americans by 1600 had created the world's first truly global economy going on. In addition, the meeting of these two new societies, produced a genuinely new world, and the fact that these two worlds, the collision of these two worlds, changed the planet, everything as well. However, we also know it was one of the greatest catastrophes the world had ever known. 90% of American Indians had died by 1600. It led to the slavery of tens of millions of Africans. And all of this is going to, contribute to all that was going on. We also know that in 1491, the population in the Americas was approximately 50 to 70 million, with about 10 million in the U.S. And, the various tribes of North America are here, the various areas. Of course, many of you are familiar with the Cherokee and Tennessee, North Carolina area. Some of you have heard of the Pueblo in northern New Mexico and that region. And so as we move on, I want to talk about some of the origins and all that occurred with some of these areas. We do know that, the first Native Americans really arrived more than 40,000 years ago via the Bering Strait, and eventually spread to the tip of South America. The new research has even shown possibly 50,000 years ago as well. But, other groups may have used boats to reach sites as well. But they developed, for the most part, civilizations that, continued. The Inca civilization in Peru, and the Aztecs in Mexico, the Mayans in the Yucatan Peninsula were earlier than them. And for the most part, there were hundreds of tribes, all with differing lifestyles. In many respects, historians until recently have kind of lumped many of the Native American groups all together. And it's only in the last 50 or 60 years where we note the big differences between these groups going into it. Okay, North American Indians were probably the less developed of these groups by the time Columbus came to the Americas. Most people lived in small scattered settlements. Many were nomadic. Some of the tribes were not, were non-migratory and could sustain themselves due to the natural resources in the region. But overall, we're going to see, these tribes that are developed. The ideas that, what people could do, this mobile lifestyle led to a great group of hunter-gatherers overall. The hunter-gatherers, would go out and the men would generally hunt. The women would manage the affairs at home while they were hunting, and ultimately, they would do the gathering. And we'll see this especially in the really just throughout North America. There was some agriculture developed, and interestingly, and it's one of the great cultural clashes between the European and Americans, women were mostly in charge of the agriculture. Like I said, men were the hunters, women did the gardening and so forth. And one of the things that we'll see are what's called the three sisters, the big crops, maize, squash, and beans, which will provide nutrients and food for the Native American groups in North America. Also, most societies in North America were matrilineal. Women owned the property. Iroquois is a good example of that. Men taught their children by persuasion and example, but for the most part, property was just not important to the Native Americans. Few really cared to acquire more property than could be carried from one site to another, and part of that was the nomadic lifestyle that so many of them had. And this was the antithesis of European property. Europeans, land ownership distinguished who they were. It was their status. And there really was not land ownership. And so once again, when the Europeans interact with these early Native Americans, they're really coming into facing some differences. Like I said, in Europe, men, worked in the fields. In North America, women worked in the field. And when, the Europeans tried to enslave the Native Americans and put Native Americans to work in the fields, they felt that this was not their work to do. This cultural, it just didn't make sense to them. In Europe, land was often passed. It was a patrilineal society. It was passed from father to son. Whereas much of the, women owned the property in Native American societies. And Europe, property determined status, whereas in North America or the Americas, individual land ownership, even in societies that were not nomadic, was just not important. It was collective as well. Also, one other thing that was very important to the Indians in these areas was trade. And, the trade was, unlike European contracts and business transactions, it just existed. And when trade stopped, it was tantamount to declaring war. And so we'll see the importance of trade amongst the Native American groups. And then overall, you can kind of look, if we're going to look at the modern day United States, you could divide different societies. There were the Great Plains Indians, of course, known for the buffalo. The Southwest, many of you probably heard of the Pueblo, California, Great Basin, and so forth. Eastern Woodland, where the Iroquois were. I think many of you have learned of that in 8th grade. And of course, the Southeast Indians, the Cherokee, the Chickasaw, the Creek, Choctaw, and so forth, in this area. And so, as we talk, I want to talk a little bit about each of these groups. I want to talk a little bit about each of these groups. I want to start with the Great Plains Indians. The Great Plains Indians, for the most part, were largely nomadic, although they did engage in sedentary farming. They grew maize or corn and other grains, and some of them did live in permanent settlements because of this. But the buffalo became the most important, and especially the nomadic tribes really depend upon the buffalo for sustenance. They, they could use the skin of the buffalo for both shelter and clothing. And this nomadic lifestyle was actually further enhanced when the Spanish brought horses to the New World. It enabled a much larger population to be dependent on buffalo hunting as well. And like I said, despite the fact that we see this this hunting in this group of the buffalo, other tribes didn't have buffalo. They had to rely on others. The Pueblo, for example, they were the Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico, Arizona, Southwest Colorado. It's a very dry region, and so they of course relied upon maize or corn, and it was facilitated by large, elaborate irrigation systems that very efficiently used water in this super dry climate. They also, because of the heat, they built multi-storied and terraced dwellings. For example, you can see the samples of Mesa Verde and so forth. And they developed large towns that became centers of trades as well. And some of the Pueblo villages are still among the oldest in North America. And in fact, historians are debating whether the first The second permanent settlement was Santa Fe or Jamestown. St. Augustine was the first and the oldest permanent settlement in the United States. But Santa Fe had been until recently considered to be the third, but now there's questions whether it actually was settled before Jamestown. Okay. The Mound Builders are Mississippians, and I think the pictures kind of show how they lived. This when I say Mississippians, think more of the Mississippi River rather than Mississippi the state. The Cahoyca, for example, were near St. Louis. They perhaps rivaled Egyptian architecture. If you look at some of the mounds that they built compared with the pyramids, the central mound was 100 feet one of the world's largest earthenworks. And Cahoyca was actually the largest city north of Mexico. They used iron tools. They wore woven fabrics. And their trade spanned from the Appalachians to the Rockies, through the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico. By about 1400, they abandoned the city of Cahoyca, largely to the impact of the Little Ice Age, which had lowered global temperatures, which disrupted their society. The Southeast American Indians were also descendants of the Cahoycas, and they settled east of the Mississippi. You can see on this map some of the Cherokee claims and the original extent. Also the Creeks, Choctaw, Chickasaws were among some of these tribes as well. And, the Cherokees themselves lived in parts of Georgia, Tennessee, and North Carolina, where at one point the Cahoyca had dominated. These groups, they had relied upon shelters, typical shelter, and developed, semi-sedentary, semi-nomadic lifestyles. Okay. Also, the eastern woodlands, and probably the most well-known were the Iroquois Confederacy, which consisted of different groups: the Mohawk, the Oneida, the Onondaga, the Cayuga, and the Seneca. And the eastern, once again, these eastern woodland Indians were also were very semi-sedentary. Farming had taken root, although there was still hunting and gathering for food, for meat. And the Iroquois, of course, this confederacy built a strong military, which led by Hiawatha in the late 16th century in what is today New York State, as well. And the foundation of the Iroquois culture, here's a longhouse, anywhere from 8 to 200 feet in length. Like I said, the economy had been a mix of hunting, gathering, and agriculture. The longhouses, they began as wooden frames covered with seasoned bark. You might have a dozen families live in a structure that could be 100 feet long, up to 200. A high wall around the village was cleared land used to raise crops and also to protect from enemies. There were cooking fires, which were built under smoke holes, which closed against rain or snow. And the families slept on the low platforms. The higher shelves were used for storage and could pretty much do what they wanted. Like I said, 1492, of course, is an important year as Columbus sailed into the Caribbean, and for the first time, Europeans became aware of this new world, this Americas. And we're going to see some major differences as more and more Europeans come to the New World, major differences that are going to develop. First, the religious view. The Spanish, in particular, were Catholic. Later on, you have Protestants coming over into North America as well. And their point of view is that God gave Adam dominion over animals and plants. However, the Bible didn't mention American Indians. Where did they come from? And for many of the Europeans, when they came and they saw some sacrificial temples, they saw, snake motifs in Mesoamerica, they associated this with, worshiping Satan in their eyes, as well. And it's interesting because they saw human sacrifices that the Native Americans were making, yet the Spanish Inquisition burned thousands of heretics at the stake, which the American Indians saw that as human sacrifices. And from the American Indian point of view, they had, there was a change they didn't understand in many respects. The Catholics preached the eating the body and blood of Christ. And they ate, to their point of view, they're eating their own God, yet they're, upset with their sacrifices. American Indians also had no concept of heaven in the Christian sense as well. There were also differences in warfare. American Indians were curious why Europeans sought decisive battles on an open battlefield. They saw that as a tremendous waste of humans that could be used, for other things. And they preferred guerrilla type warfare as well. And, Europeans, when they couldn't easily catch American Indian warriors, they often resorted to killing women and children. The Pequot War, which you read about in one of the other chapters, was one of the more gruesome examples. And unfortunately, the Indians also began to do this. King Philip's War, they had learned this lesson well and destroyed Puritan villages, killing non-combatants. When American Indians in warfare captured children of other tribes, they often assimilated them. However, adult warriors were often sacrificed, especially in Mesoamerica or Mexico as well. The Iroquois actually had an all-night torture ritual where Iroquois women sought retribution for death of a loved one as well for victims. And then the European weapons deeply intensified the warfare. The Native Americans did not have gunpowder, and of course the use of guns is going to greatly change warfare. And finally, I think we'd already talked about agriculture, how it was different. Like I said, there were fields that the maize, squash, and beans, of course, were important, but often women did the farming, whereas in Europe it was often men who were in control of the farming, and that will also make a difference for many of these interactions. And then finally, we look at the results of the contact, between the two. For Native Americans, it was really quite a disaster overall. Really mass death. By 1600, nearly 90% of the Native American population perished. They did not have any immunity to these European diseases, and particularly smallpox was the most deadly, but also they didn't have the flu. They didn't have yellow fever. They didn't have malaria. So they were all quite destructive, not having these immunities. It was estimated that the population of just Central America and the Caribbean was perhaps 25 million in 1519. By 1605, only 1 million remained. And the impact on American Indian culture was also greatly changed. Number one, the introduction of the horse. There were no horses in the New World, and this totally transformed it. The Great Plains Indians used the horse for buffalo hunts and so forth. Cattle and swine provided major new food sources to Native Americans as well. And the introduction of firearms intensified warfare amongst the American Indian tribes, leading to depopulation. For Europeans, we're going to see for the first time in their history these global empires, and we'll see in many respects an explosion of capitalism. Wealth generated by mining of gold and silver and the use of slave labor is going to result in a shift in Europe from feudalism to capitalism. And also changes in their diet. Corn, and particularly the potato, is going to lead to an improved diet, which meant higher mortality, which meant higher population, which also meant a bigger push for emigration to the New World at the expense of the Native Americans. Also see the, different changes. For example, the use of tobacco, which didn't exist in Europe, will become widespread use. Coffee, which didn't exist in the New World, will be grown extensively in South America overall. And so we'll see, all of this. And part of this was also part of what we call the Columbian Exchange. Once again, there were two worlds that existed that were unaware of each other, and there were items that existed. And so a technical definition of the Columbian Exchange would be the exchange of plants, animals, and diseases amongst the Europeans. And it wasn't an exchange in a trade-like sense. The Native Americans, for example, didn't have, there was not smallpox in the New World. Conversely, there was not syphilis in the Old World. And so, it wasn't like, oh, we'll give you syphilis if you give us smallpox, but rather just the fusion of these two cultures kind of brought it together. So this visual shows a lot. Some of the things that didn't exist in Europe: tomato, potato, tobacco, corn in particular. were, turkeys that existed only in the New World, did not exist in Europe, and they were brought into Europe and Asia and Africa. On the other hand, we're going to see coffee, olives, citrus fruits. We think of Florida for oranges. There were no oranges in Florida prior to 1492. Um, sugar, which the Caribbean became known for, sugar cane. There was no sugar cane in the Caribbean. Some of the grains, of course, and then livestock, probably the most important, the horse, but also cattle, pig, and sheep that didn't exist in the New World. And of course, we have the deadly diseases. Smallpox is the most deadly, but also influenza, typhus, malaria, measles, and so forth. And so we'll see these changes, within the culture, and it will, totally affect, both the old world and the new. The last thing I'd like to talk about really is just a little bit about settlement in Spanish North America. And the Spanish, later on, we'll discuss the French, British, and Dutch interactions with the Native Americans and their development of their empires. But the Spanish, you've probably heard before the three G's, God, gold, and glory. And so in order to really kind of understand where the Spanish were coming from, let's first talk about the motivations for exploration. First of all, the Spanish were competing with the Portuguese for trade routes. They were these goods that had been cut off from Europe when the Ottoman Turks conquered Constantinople. Many of the traditional land routes had been uh, cut off, and so they were looking for sea routes. And remember, not knowing that the New World was there, the Columbus believed he sailed west, he could hit the Indies. In fact, the name American Indians come from the fact that Columbus believed that he had actually landed in probably the islands of Indonesia, somewhere around that area. Okay. We're also going to see, though, like I said, the three G's continue. Gold. There was silver mines in particular in South America. The sugar is in the Caribbean is going to enrich Europeans. And so that will be another motivation as well. But then let's not forget God. Spain was different than France, Britain, and the Netherlands in the fact that religion was sponsored by the state, and religion justified the enslavement of the Native Americans. And so Catholicizing the Indians was very important, saving their souls to the Spanish during this time as well, and another important motivation. Okay. And of course, the glory of the conquistadors, the fact that, and for the nation, these nations were competing with each other. And really, after Columbus's voyage to the New World, we're going to see the Spanish Golden Age throughout the 1500s as probably the most dominant power in the world. Okay. As far as Spain's colonial empire, a few things that, did occur. We are going to see, of course, you read about the conquering of the Aztec and the Inca. You've heard about that. But in North America, we're going to see the establishment of of New Mexico, and Texas and California. We're also going to see the development of what's called the encomienda system, which is important to understand. And what it was, the encomienda system was, in a way, it justified using the Indians for slave labor. American Indians were forced to do unpaid labor, building roads, buildings, and other infrastructure. This was actually not something that was unknown of at the time. The Inca practice called the mita as well. But it was really part of the whole encomienda system was the fact that it was justified by Christianizing them and doing that. As far as, like I said, we already know the results. The loss of massive Native American lives will also lead later on to the development of the slave system because they're losing laborers. The encomienda system became unfeasible. Another thing that will develop will be the development of the mestizo culture. Because of the death of so many Native Americans and because many Spaniards that came over were just single men, we're going to see a mixed culture, a mixed European and Native American that will develop during this time period. And what we'll see with this mestizo culture will be this, this change, this new culture, and it'll be a pyramid where those that were Europeans were at the top of this period. Mestizos were not. Those that were mixed, and the Native Americans, of course, were not. But we will see the development of this culture. We're also going to see another way to convert Native Americans will be the mission system. Father Junipero Serra is most known for this. It was founded in New Mexico in the 17th century, later went to California and Texas. And this forbade the practice of American Indian religion. Their practices were driven underground. Later on, we'll talk about the Pope's Rebellion, which was an attempt to bring that back. But ultimately, these missions were established. California became especially an area. That was her father, Junipero Serra, had actually established his first mission in San Diego. And it came to influence the architecture of many schools, of homes, public buildings. The vaqueros from Spanish Mexico first arrived. They worked on ranches. And this is where we kind of see the beginning of the cowboy culture. But once again, to keep in mind that the big idea, these Spanish Mexican songs and ballad blended with these other cultural influences of the Southwest, and continued to this distinctive Latin American culture of mestizos, it's American Indian and Spanish children. We will also see, like I said, the importance of the Catholic religion. Notice the crosses in the picture. American Indians, of course, they had what was known as the Black Legend. Had them fear of the Spanish, and the fact that with the Spanish, whenever they, touched in the New World, they killed. And of course, with the number of deaths, you can see that as rational. And in fact, it's going to lead to something called the Pueblo Revolt, or the Pope's Rebellion, in 1680, where American Indians are going to rebel against Spanish rule in New Mexico and expel them for, I think, close to 12 years. There had been massive suffering among Indians from a famine that had occurred in the late 1660s, and Spanish authorities' harshness with the Pueblos, from backsliding to Christianity and practicing some of their own cultural religious elements, are going to add to the anxiety. And ultimately, the Spanish authorities will regain control after the Pope's Rebellion, but they'll be forced to compromise on the issue. American Indians could practice some of their beliefs as long as they attended Catholic Mass, and kind of developed a hybrid of Catholic and indigenous religious beliefs and practices as well. That is it for today. I just wanted to make sure that you were good with this chapter, and look forward to having you in class and seeing you soon.